Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this short video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous night of the local time. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Poltava, more precisely about Myrhorod, about the airfield that located in the vicinity of this city. We have a lot of very interesting geolocations and very interesting video that was published by the Russian sources. For example, in this video we can see the aircraft Su-20 of Su-27 type that Ukrainians carried out on the open space. Probably they were planning to attack the Russian forces somewhere in Kharkiv direction. I'll remind you that during the previous few weeks or 3 weeks we got significant number of videos of how the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian positions in Kharkiv direction with J-dam bombs and with Hammer bombs of French production. And for those purposes the Ukrainians were using Su-27, and that means that most likely the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian positions exactly from this airfield. So as you can see, as a result of reconnaissance operation, the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian personnel who were preparing the Su-27 before another flight. And as a result of Iskander strike, the Russians managed to destroy the Ukrainian aircraft. I'll remind you that recently the Russians start using new types of Iskander missiles with the cluster, that's a warhead, and of course using the cluster warhead, the Russians improve their possibilities of destroying aircrafts on any airfield all over the entire territory of Ukraine. So the Ukrainians suffered significant losses. According to some military experts, the Ukrainians suffered the biggest losses of this type since the beginning of the special military operation. Now let's move in Kharkiv direction. We have a lot of very interesting details and updates. As for Hlyboke and Liptsi, according to the Russian sources, the Ukrainians continue concentration and accumulation of their forces before the next waves and before the next attempts to attack the village of Hlyboke. For now, there is a small operational pause. The Ukrainians suffered significant losses during the battles during the previous days, so that's why they try to accumulate, and most likely very soon they will renew their attempts to attack the Russians. Now let's move to Vovchansk area. We have a lot of very interesting details. First, let's talk about Vovchansk citadel, because according to information we have during the previous few days, as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to enter the citadel and to capture at least 3 buildings inside of this area, and it was very difficult to understand whether the Russians managed to hold their positions or they were forced to fall back under Ukraine counterattacks. And today we got the answer to this question. In this video, for example, we can see how the Russian drone was flying above the first buildings of the citadel that were captured by the Russians, and how the Russian drone was sending the Russians water, maybe food, maybe cigarettes, or maybe something else. That means that the Russians don't have secured and safe roads between the citadel and the mainland, and the only possible way how to support forces is using drones. So once again in this video we can see how the Russians dropped a bottle with water to the Russian soldiers that were controlling the citadel itself. So this video just confirms that the Russians are still there. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians conducted significant number of attempts to counterattack the Russians in the eastern Vovchansk. The Russians reported that they managed to repel every single attack, and the Ukrainians lost up to 20 soldiers. Furthermore, during the, let's say, crossing process, during the sending additional reinforcements from the southern part in the northern direction, the Ukrainians lost additional 40 soldiers. And now let's talk about the most important update that we got during the previous night from the group of forces north, and this report is coming from the village by the name of Burgovatka. The Russians are saying, more precisely the official Telegram channel of the group of forces north reported that this night, the previous night, the forces of the group of forces north, some units of group of forces north, managed to cross Siverski Donets river to the the east of Burgovatka. So this is the village of Bugrovatka. This is Siverski Donets river. So according to the group of forces north, the Russians managed to cross the river somewhere here and to establish a foothold somewhere along this red line. I'm not saying that this is like the entire foothold. Maybe the Russians captured some positions in the vicinity of Hlyboke. Maybe the Russians entered the forest to the west of Vovchansk. Currently, we don't know for sure, but the most important is that the Russians opened, let's call it like this, the second front line in Vovchansk direction, and now they began storming the southern positions of the south of Vovchansk, not just in the north of Vovchansk. Currently, the clashes are taking place also in the southern part, in the southern direction of Vovchansk. This is a very important statement, very important update. So let's follow this. Now we are moving further in the northern Kupiansk direction. We have lots of very interesting reports, and the most important, the claims of 14th Mechanized Brigade. So we haven't received such a types of video for a very long time, and now we start receiving them again. I'll remind you that as for northern Kupiansk direction, there are very heavy clashes. The Russians are in offensive state. During the previous 48 hours, the Russians managed to secure Stepovo-Novoselovka completely, and these territories also on the responsibilities of 14th Mechanized, and they start claiming that the situation is critical, the losses are very heavy, and as I understand, this brigade is about to lose its combat capabilities, or maybe they just want to be redeployed from the probably one of the most from the hottest area in the special military operation. Now let's move further. As you can see, we have lots of updates of artillery strikes, of aviation bomb strikes. So I'll remind you that there are very heavy clashes in this direction right now, and the Russians are storming still Makiivka. Today we got some geolocations, more precisely the map updates from Deep State. According to them, the Russians captured this tree line, and the video of those attacks that the mappers were using for updating their maps we saw yesterday. The Russians were storming still Makiivka from the east in the western direction. Now let's move to southern Kupiansk area. We have additional updates in the vicinity of Makiivka. Also, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians managed to establish complete control over this tree line and to get as close as possible to Makiivka itself. So, summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that if this information is confirmed, then the Russians managed to cut Makiivka already in two. So, on the northern part and the southern part, and the Ukrainians lost possibilities to supply their forces from, let's say, the village of Nevskaya to Makiivka itself. So this road was cut off by the Russians, if this information is correct. Now let's move further in direction of Liman and Kremina. We have a lot of very interesting updates, and we have another claims, but this time from the 12th Azov Brigade. They reported, more precisely, it's not like a claims, it's more some questions to the Ukrainian authorities, and they call it that. We have 5 questions for recruiters of Ukraine, and the main questions, if summarize everything, are about why the Ukrainian authorities are not mobilizing rich people and people who has power, like governors, mayors, and businessmen, rich people, and many other types of society who has money, let's call it like this. And you know that I mentioned that now the Ukrainian authorities try to make this Azov Brigade popular once again, because we haven't been receiving anything about them, but the first time we start getting updates about this brigade when they wrote some application paper on the General Sodol, who was responsible for many losses in Ukraine. And I remind you that Ukrainians called him a butcher. According to Ukrainians, he killed more Ukrainians than the Russians since the beginning of the special military operation. And now we see another episode of truth, let's call it like this, when the 12th Brigade asked why the recruit centers don't mobilize the rich people and people who has power. So we see that Ukrainians are trying to make them like something like unique, something bigger than just a brigade. So very interesting process. Let's follow this. Now let's move further. We have additional updates from Chasiv Yar direction. According to mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to capture significant territories towards the village by the name of Grigorovka. So during the previous update, updates we got report just about control over this forest, and now the Russians managed to move even further and to get as close as possible to village itself. Significant progress, and let's see what is going to be next. Also, the Russians reported, not the Russians, the mappers reported that the Russians captured the forest between Kalinovka and Chasiv Yar itself and reached Siverski Donetsk Canal completely. We got this report a few days ago, and if you remember the video when the Russians crossed the Siverski Donetsk Canal, there's some sabotage group, so this is not something new. This is that happened probably a few days ago. As for the area in the vicinity of Donetsk, no changes as you can see. Now we are moving to the western Avdiivka area, where we got also significant number of updates. And according to information we have on different mappers, the Russians continue advancing further in the western direction on the northwestern part of Sokol, and as a result of offensive, the Russians managed to secure additional true line on their way to the villages of Progress and Vovcha. This territory was captured according to different mappers and was confirmed by different mappers as well. Furthermore, we have additional updates from Yasnobrodovka. Probably this is the first day in a row when the Russians reported about complete control over the village. When talking about the previous 4 days, we were receiving just the Telegram post and Twitter post, and as for the 2nd of July, for the first time we got some changes on map. So we have adjusted the contested area as well, but if this information is correct, probably the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation will confirm it today as well during their daily military report. Also, we have reports about additional Russian progress towards Nyvoyska. So I'll remind you that a few months ago the Russians already captured the village, but later, and that was reported by the Ministry of Defense, later the Ukrainians managed to restore control over this territory, and now the Russians began this another battle for the village, and they managed to secure the territory to the east of the village and to get and to semi-encircle the farms that located in the northwestern part of the settlement. So I believe that the days are numbered. As for Krasnogorovka, we haven't received anything, just geolocations of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians in the most central part in the park. So this is something like the artillery preparation before the final episode, before the final chapter of the battle for this territory. So also we can state that the Krasnogorovka days are numbered, and probably the Russians will try to capture up to 90% before the NATO summit. Furthermore, we continue receiving updates of a storming process in the eastern Krasnogorovka citadel. I'll remind you that during the previous days, the Ukrainians have almost abandoned this territory due to significant losses and risks of being encircled by the Russians. So the Russians basically are now clearing some empty buildings and clearing the rear guard forces that were left by the Ukrainians during the previous days of clashes. As for Konstantinovka, Novomykhailovka, there are very heavy clashes. The Russians published a lot of videos of how they were bombing the Ukrainian positions. I'll remind you that starting of yesterday, the Russians resumed their attempts to capture or to break through the Ukrainian defense belt. As a result of first days of clashes, the Russians suffered losses without significant changes on the ground, but that was just the beginning of this operation. Today they will continue most likely. The Ukrainians of the 72nd Brigade published the video of the first results of the first days of clashes of Russian full-scale, let's say, broad front line attack starting from Solotka to Konstantinovka, Novomykhailovka, and summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that yes, the Russians did lose significant number of armored vehicles just for the first day of clashes. That's it for the situation on the ground. We have also lots of very interesting reports from Ukraine itself. Today, starting of the 2nd of July, we start receiving lots of updates from different sources, pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian and neutral sources, about another conflict between Zelensky and the new commander-in-chief Siverski. And people are saying that Zelensky office announces his dissatisfaction with the commander-in-chief. I'll remind you that Zelensky to complete the special military operation, wants to get his satisfaction, and probably the conflict between Zelensky and Siverski is one of the small part and small episode of his dissatisfaction. So until he gets his satisfaction, he will not finish the special military operation, at least from his side. Also, the information about the conflict between Commander-in-Chief and Zelensky himself was confirmed by pro-Russian sources, and the report by a group of forces north. So for now, Zelensky is not going to replace Siverski, but also, according to information we have, during the NATO summit that is going to take place very soon in July, there are going to be lots of changes in Ukrainian authorities. Lots of people, highly ranked people, will be replaced, probably by some managers from the Western countries or who passed some trainings or exercises or schools in the Western countries. Furthermore, we got additional reports about military crimes investigations. As we discussed, lots of generals of armed forces of Ukraine were arrested or got under investigation due to significant losses in Kharkiv, in many other directions. And according to information we have, the Ukrainians began investigations about the process, about the cases, not in this year, but since the beginning of the special military operation. We continue receiving more and more updates from the borderlands with Belarus, and this is very interesting. Special forces of armed forces of Ukraine arrived in Ovro, Zhytomyr region, 5 kilometers from the Belarus. With Belarus, Ukraine armed forces drones enter Belarusian territory at the distance up to 1 kilometer. By the way, yes, Minsk said that it would not hesitate to use nuclear weapons. So as for the previous days, by the 2nd of July, when talking about the situation on the border with Belarus and Ukraine, we were receiving just a telegram post without any photos or geolocations. And starting of the 2nd of July, we started receiving first photos of real presence of Ukrainians on the border with Belarus. And as you can see, the Ukrainians concentrated significant number of forces. And there are two important details that I would like to point your attention. First of all, these photos were published by the 30th Jaeger Brigade, which, according to deployment map, is located exactly on the border with Belarus. Another important thing is that as for the units and the forces this brigade has, now we have a lot of vehicles of Belarusian production that were bought by Ukraine probably before the special military operation. This is not something like big, but also very interesting detail that the Ukrainians concentrated the equipment that was produced by Belarus in the past. And one of the most important update is the tactical sign. As you can see, the Ukrainians on the border with Belarus are using the triangle as a tactical sign. And I'll remind you that at the beginning of the special military operation, when the Russian forces were attacking Kiev from Gomel district towards the capital of Ukraine, the Russians were using the same tactical sign on their equipment. So some interesting details about the situation. So let's see how the conflict, how this where the process will lead to. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.